Palantir.
Hey, this is not a test. This is rock and roll. Time to rock it from the Delta to the DMZ. Is that me or does that sound like an Elvis Presley movie? Viva Da Nang. Oh, viva.
Welcome back to the channel, everyone. This is the inaugural episode of Code and Coffee. We're going to be bringing you all kinds of things Palantir related and also generally just software related, which is the subject of today's video, right? Which is software 3.0. I don't know if you guys caught this talk that Andrew Karpathy gave. It was probably last week, maybe a week ago. Here we go. Let's dive in. If you haven't, I'll leave a link in the description. But basically, he's making the case in this talk that software 3.0 is sort of this introduction of programmable neural nets into the stack, right? So like we've got this introduction of natural language that is now being compiled into these and ran inside these neural nets, essentially, and this is reshaping software. And we're starting to see a lot of natural language, for example, show up in GitHub. And this is around your prompt engineering, et cetera. And I tend to agree with them. I think that it is kind of an interesting way to think about the problem in terms of like, okay, now we have these generalized sort of neural nets for natural language processing. We can program them at runtime. We can get them to do all kinds of interesting things. But I think the thing that I want to focus in on today for the purposes of this discussion is like, what is that good for, right? It's not good for everything, but like, what is it good for, right? And so I think, initially when I look at like, okay, what is this fundamentally allowing me to do as a developer that I couldn't do before? What sort of use cases is it going to open up? One of the things I land on immediately is non-deterministic control flow, right? And so like, what does non-deterministic control flow means? It means that instead of like rigid if then else statements you would normally put into your code bases, we are very limited in the type of logical operations we can actually compute inside software. So instead of just relying on if then else and sort of this traditional logic gates, we can now replace those with neural nets. And what that allows us to do is move from, say, like if you're doing a user registration system, and in there you're computing all these state attributes about the user. Are they over 18? Do they match this profile for this special offer, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, which most registration systems do, including the geo-targeting, et cetera. You can combine that traditional logic with a set of rules that you could just tell the LLM, right? You could basically say, instead of having to write all those if then else, I can just give the LLM the actual rules of the system, right? Like, if this happens, do this. If this happens, do this. The user must be over 18, blah, 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 blah. And then let the LLM figure out what the next best action is based on the user input and the feedback it gets from the system. That opens up way more pathways of possible ways that we can explore, or possible paths that we can explore in the program. We don't have to code them all out, which is usually impossible, and why we get such sort of like one of the biggest things in code bases that lead to what I consider kind of crappy code is this problem around control flow. The other is state management, which is sort of related when we'll look at that in the solution design around this. But basically, like, the idea that I could loosely couple a bunch of stuff together with a neural net that will then pick the next best action based on the rules of the system in the current state, that actually is a much cleaner solution in a lot of cases and leads to better code than the traditional deterministic code flows. Now, that doesn't mean you use it everywhere. Of course, there are going to be places where you want traditional logic gating and control flow, but it is very useful for these sort of classic long tail problems where there's like always edge cases that are very hard to compute. These neural nets are filling in a very valuable gap for this non-deterministic control flow. And I believe in the talk that Karpathy gave, he does mention this at Tesla, where they used neural nets in self-driving instead of basically replacing a rules-based engine. This could also be really useful, for example, in this healthcare space. Like a huge reason claims get rejected by payers is that they all have these various esoteric rules about how they submit claims and the format they have to be in. Rather than having to compute all of that out in a rules engine via forms, it would be neat if you could just write it down, right? And then the neural net will tell you like, hey, you're missing this information, etc. So like cataloging rules in natural language, I think is actually be really valuable source of data mining in the future for prompt engineering and model training, etc. Especially if you're going to do like model distillation. So if you're going to make like domain specific models that know a specific domain. Imagine you had a domain specific model for every healthcare provider and payer on the planet that you distill from a large language model. That could be very useful in figuring out how you interact with that payer or provider, right? So like cataloging this information and using it in software for non-deterministic control flow, very valuable. And I think that's a key part of like what is software 3.0 good for. The other is language as the inputs and the outputs of the system. So like today, all of you interact with software. I'm interacting with software right now, recording this through a GUI. I have to click on all these buttons. I have to fill out all these fields. Imagine if every piece of software you used was accessible through a single natural language interface, right? So think ChatGPT. You go to ChatGPT, but instead of being limited to running web searches or whatever else you've hooked up in there, it just did everything. Like it could control StreamYard, which I'm streaming from right now. It could control X. It could basically wrap the entire global API economy in a natural language interface. I think everyone's life gets better at that point. You don't have to remember all these shitty esoteric ways you use a UI and all these various settings and this sort of general knowledge overhead we have, the stress that is related to interfacing with software on a day-to-day basis. I mean, just communications management, which I may show you guys a demo of Vicky here in a second, of how we are using natural language to power our communications management, not having to jump between Slack and Outlook and meeting transcripts, et cetera, just having one natural language interface to schedule meetings, read my email, get a summary of the meeting transcripts, et cetera, assign myself tasks. Vicky's like an executive assistant that does all this stuff for us. That has really reduced my cognitive load on a daily basis, not having to jump between these things. So language as the inputs and the outputs of the system may fundamentally shape software into a single UI layer. And I think, from the rumors I'm hearing, this is what OpenAI is focused on, like a new browser to end all browsers that essentially does this. This is something Databricks 1, the new Databricks vision for business users interacting with their interfaces, attempting to do, like a single natural language layer, and then you can present charts and graphs and all kinds of stuff in there. I haven't heard of Palantir working on this specifically. I know that they are working on like an AI FDE and an autopilot that sort of blend some of these things, but I think generally what we're trying to build for Foundry at CodeStrap is a single natural language interface to administer Foundry, essentially like run all your settings and like perform actions against your data sets and basically anything you could do through the point and click interface in Foundry. We want to be able to automate through natural language. And that could be really useful for customers who are struggling with things like maintaining their Foundry stacks or keeping applications up to date and responding to platform updates and alerts. We basically see it as like the next level of a command line utility that could be used primarily by engineers. I don't see this as like a tool for your average business user, but that's something we're working on. It would be neat to see like a Databricks 1 type thing come out for Foundry, and they have all the prerequisite stuff with this like AI FDE. So I think like if they continue down this road, that might be the right interface for like the business user. And man, does that reduce the training you need for the system. So like another interesting thing about language being the inputs and the outputs of the system is you don't need as much training on the system. You do need a lot of engineering to go into building the automation and to interact with the APIs, but the LLMs, the programmable neural nets in this case, are used primarily for marshaling inputs and outputs, meaning they're extracting parameters from what the human is telling them, asking for clarifying information where parameters are incomplete, and then they're getting the outputs from the calls into these APIs via tools and presenting those back to the user, right? And so that's actually an easy space to work in. So like really the heavy lifting of things like the platform SDK and other parts of the automation stack that are traditional software, it's traditional code, that has to be plugged into this new language interface layer that I'm talking about. So those are the two kind of primary ways I see programmable neural nets reshaping software and being useful, right? Non-deterministic control flow. You basically write down the rules of the system and let the AI pick the next best action. And then this idea that language can be the inputs and the outputs of the system. And again, that is applicable in a ton of use cases, from insurance claims to banking to like you have to pay a bill to an infinite number of use cases really at the end of the day. And I think it will fundamentally reshape the stack. You will start seeing this everywhere. I don't see a non-traditional stack, or I don't see a traditional stack surviving that much longer or being competitive that much longer. Maybe in certain domains, lower, languages that are lower in the stack, and you're working on essentially harder, low-level problems, sure. But in these web application, mobile application, business, enterprise application space, no way. Like this is 10 times better than how we used to write code. And then if you also look at the applications for software engineering on top of that, you'll see an acceleration of these new types of apps being built because engineers are essentially being able to spit out code faster. That doesn't necessarily mean it's quality, but they are able to produce code faster. It's making code more of a commodity, and it is easier to rewrite and replatform these older applications to take advantage of these new features. So that's my take on software 3.0. I like Karpathy's take, but like there's also this other side of the coin, which is, man, are a lot of enterprises pissed off and let down by trying to build agentic solutions that take advantage of these attributes: non-deterministic control flow, language as the inputs and outputs. There's some early rumbling that the latest reports from the big four that are coming out is showing like a large letdown among larger institutions and enterprises in implementing these. Now, I would say that there's probably some nuance in there. I would say some people are succeeding. We see successes, with Palantir customers, for example, the insurance use case that was brought up by Sham a while ago, taking underwriting down from, I think it was weeks to hours or something like that, or days to hours. We see at AIPCon and other conferences Palantir is hosting that their customers seem to be succeeding, where others are failing. I think in large part that has to do with people. Like if you have the right people working on these problems that have experience and know what they're doing, your outcomes are generally going to be better. And Palantir are some of the best people on the planet for building these use cases. They both understand how to use their technology to shape the business problem in a way that it can be simplified and delivered and deployed on Foundry, which is a huge part of the sort of complexity layer in building agentic solutions. Like Foundry just natively solves security end to end, for example. Like you have to build that yourself, and it's not in the spec, and it's not in the thing the business is looking at typically when they're like, oh, we're going to automate process X, Y, or Z, and no one's telling them, yeah, that's great, but do you have a end-to-end security model in place so that when these models are accessing data, they're doing so under the scoped permissions of the user? You can do things like respect row level security and encrypted data, et cetera, et cetera. And the answer is always no, and that's a big reason these things fail. Is just like you aren't going to capture the full set of requirements in a spec document. I think a large part of what Foundry is delivering for these 8 agentic solutions is a single platform where you can bring all the organization's data together and securely access it in these agentic use cases. And the last mile of like using these programmable neural nets to do non-deterministic control flow and language as the inputs and outputs, that's actually relatively easy. There's like a million of those out there. Like I think there's a product N8N or something that does visual building for agents. There's like a million of them being funded by VCs. You're going to see that stuff all over the place. That's the last mile. That's easy. Our framework, X Reason, we consider it a better solution, but it's also extremely easy. There's probably 600 lines of code in the whole thing, and it powers sales agents, it powers executive concierge, soon to be project managers. Like you can build a lot with very little code if you know what you're doing, and you look at this problem from the standpoint of like state machines. But I think the hard part is what Foundry gives you without AIP. Like Foundry gives you all of the things you need to integrate all of your organization's data together in a single place and provide end-to-end security. And as it turns out, those are probably the 2 hardest things in agentic use cases. Like the number one way you can produce a high quality agentic system is to ground the model in the exact right information it needs to do its job, right? If you can give the model the exact right information, that's probably the best way to guarantee you're getting a quality answer to a high value question. And Palantir Foundry is the premier platform in the world to bring together all the unstructured data, which is more valuable than the structured data, by the way. Like the unstructured data is like emails and text messages and meeting transcripts, like where your business is actually happening on a daily basis. That's where all the timely, up to date information is. Turns out that's extremely valuable and more valuable than the structured data sources in those cases. If you can bring all of that data together in one place and provide a single grounding process for your agents, meaning grounding is I ask a question, the model needs to go find the exact right information to answer it and put it in the context window and then synthesize the answer using that information. If you can do that, you can actually get the right answer to the question. And Foundry is the premier platform to do model grounding, in my opinion, because you can bring together securely from data ingestion all the way out to usage by the LLM in the application layer. All of this data, you govern it under a single security model. It's incredible at that. And I think all those tools in Foundry are 10 times more valuable now that grounding is so important to building quality agentic systems. So I think that's why Palantir is probably a little differentiated in this space. And then the other things in Foundry that make this really useful is like beyond being able to like ground the model and have an integrated security system and have access to private model endpoints like in AIP, you can make these things accessible and deployable really easily. So like there's this kind of joke going around that like I think Andrew Karpathy brought this up in that talk I was referencing. Again, I'll leave a link in the description. Is like they spent most of their time trying to deploy this shit. It wasn't like trying to build the solution. It was like, oh my God, I got to deploy this thing, and then I got to add logins, and then like I got to add this other database systems. Like all the shit you didn't think about, all the engineering that goes into deploying any software application can be hard. Foundry makes that extremely easy. It's just out of the box. The OSDK is the bridge for those systems. In fact, I think I'll probably bring up an OSDK app I built just to show you guys like our solution for Vicky, which I'll be releasing as a foundational ontology. So this foundational ontology I'm going to show you in the OSDK, which is what you call a third-party application in Foundry. It allows you to package up all these resources. Like here are all my ontology objects that go into our agentic solutions for executive assistance and sales. They're all packaged up as a set of ontology objects and then actions. These are essentially the tools, the things the model can do. We leverage a technology under the hood called XState to build dynamic state machines from user input, which allows us to dynamically construct the agent's workflow at runtime versus having to model it out ahead of time like you typically see in AIP Logic or Ada or these other tools where you kind of model a visual workflow. We build that workflow dynamically at runtime. But anyway, the OSDK allows you to control authentication and token access to all of these assets, and it will govern the model's access to these things under the same permissions as the end user who's actually using the application. And what's great about the OSDK is we actually use it to deploy in compute modules as well. So if we look at compute modules, what's a compute module? We'll try and take a look at this. They're exposed via my Docker container that I've compiled and sent up to the registry in Foundry where the container image lives. I can expose all those things I showed you earlier in the OSDK, which we use to power our Vercel applications. That same code is running here in a Docker container for those same functions. And that allows us to embed Vicky in all of our Foundry apps, right? So like if we take a look at, let's share this tab. I don't care if you see my email, it's out there publicly. This is AIP Agent Studio, which lets you build chat interfaces for Vicky or for anything, basically. And what Vicky is doing here, she's embedded and actually using the compute module I was just showing you. Those were the functions that this model has been taught to use are being called. And I can actually access the same Vicky that's running in Vercel inside Foundry, anywhere Foundry accepts it. So like Workshop, AIP Logic, like wherever you can call a function, you can access Vicky inside Foundry. And so like the whole point of this is just to say that Foundry makes it extremely easy to build your code once, run it anywhere, and deploy it and manage it. And those are all the hard parts of like these agentic stacks that people are underestimating. In Foundry, it's just to solve a problem. So like, yeah, of course, customers are going to succeed more when you have a solution for model grounding and you manage all the hard parts of deployment, security, authorization. Again, like these things were in Foundry before AIP, with the exception of the OSDK. That's relatively new, but they're not AI and they're not like AI products. You know, like all these things I'm telling you, these were foundational things Palantir needed to build so there would be a solution for a general solution to building data-driven enterprise applications, right? The categorical solution to all of the problems that are in that space, which are a large number. I mean, it could take a decade and billions of dollars to try and recreate something like Foundry. People always underestimate exactly what's in there, and just because it's a categorical solution to sort of enterprise data-driven applications, all of those things now are more valuable that we have these programmable neural nets because the range of use cases and things we can start doing with them, especially if you can solve these harder problems like model grounding and security authorization and deployment, like we could actually start winning and reshaping enterprise. And I think that's what you're seeing with a large cohort of Palantir customers who are lucky enough to be working with the right people. They're succeeding where others are failing. And I think that you will start to see like the winners, the people who are succeeding, really start to break away from the competition. And it's really going to force these people who are upset in enterprises to reevaluate who their partners are, what their tech stack is, and who's giving them advice. Because a lot of times they're getting just shitty advice from people who are managing risk, not looking at innovation. And nor do they have the reps with the technology to even offer an informed opinion about it, right? If you got a person who hasn't issued a commit in a code base ever, or in the last decade, giving you advice on how you're supposed to leverage this technology, you are talking to the wrong people. This domain right now is a builder's domain, and it's that way because this technology is so new. it's so raw, it's so hard to wrap your brain around unless you actually use it. Then you can't be an observer here. You can't be someone who's reading McKinsey reports or taking a 6-week I'm an AI expert degree and pretend that they're going to be able to advise your organization. You need people who are actually building with this shit on a daily basis. And I think at Palantir, you've got several hundred of those walking around. If you're lucky enough to be able to work with them, you're going to get a differentiated outcome, or OpenAI, for example, or us, right? So like we are also doing these things, and our partners. So I think like the real challenge here is to like find the right people and partners, and then tackle these use cases starting from the standpoint of like, what are agents really? Non-deterministic control flow, language as the inputs and outputs. Find the use cases where that's valuable and can lead to cost takeout. I think I saw the news today about how Microsoft is laying off 4% of its workforce and saving hundreds of millions of dollars directly. Like they are citing AI as the reason. You can really reshape your business if you use these tools correctly, and then have the right technology platform that's solving these hard problems you're going to run into, like model grounding. You need all your data. You can't just have silo A, B, or C. You can't just have Salesforce. You can't just have Blue Yonder. You can't just have your CRM or your MRP or whatever the fuck it is that some data silo over here. You got to bring it all together. And the most valuable data on the daily is your meeting transcripts, your emails, your Slack messages, Teams messages. All that stuff is where your business is actually run. So if you want to get a high value answer to a question like, who is managing the Oracle Alliance relationship and what are they thinking about revenue this year and growth prospects, that's not sitting in a PDF. It might be, but it's like outdated and probably drifted, a week after the thing was written. And so having all those emails and text messages and things where your business actually happens, meeting transcripts, you can answer questions like that and they can be accurate. But the only platform, in my opinion, today that can do all of this, including the last mile application serving, is Foundry. So I think if businesses want to start succeeding where others are failing, it's time to reevaluate your partners, reevaluate your tech stack, and then start to sort of bang away at these areas where you know you can actually have some success, right? And to help with that, like one of the things that we've done at CodeStrap is create Foundry developer foundations as sort of an accelerator for businesses that are looking to do just that, right? Like we have a foundational ontology for Viki that you can install via Marketplace and Benny. And we also, all the code is on GitHub. I'll pull it up here so you can take a look at it. And what's great about Foundry developer foundations, if you're a business that's, or startup or whatever that's looking to explore building agentic systems, is like you can work in all your native tools that you already know, like GitHub, and use GitHub Actions and deployments for your build system, while taking advantage of all these powerful things that I'm telling you about in Foundry to do model grounding and to be able to manage security, et cetera. We use an OSDK application inside here with dependency injection. You can learn about the X Reason framework, which is our framework here for developing agents. But the key takeaway is like you don't have to be a Foundry developer to sort of use this as an accelerator. All of our interactions with Foundry are sitting in these domain and service objects that get injected. And this is where we use the OSDK as the bridge to interact with Foundry data, call Foundry functions, do all the things that I was telling you about before that are hard, which is the security model and logins and, managing all this data centrally. The OSDK allows us to do that in these domain objects, which you see here. If you're an engineer, this will probably look pretty familiar. This is like an upsert request that uses fetch, and here I'm calling the endpoint that's going to upsert a communication. This is actually calling a function that's exposed in my OSDK application I was showing you earlier. The user, in order to use this, has to log in, and the login is via Foundry to be able to call in these actions. They get an access token, and you're off and running. So that is Foundry Developer Foundations. I'll leave a link in the description. But the challenge we're trying to solve there is like, there aren't a lot of people who are Foundry experts in the world. There's a ton of developers who need to wrap their brain around like, how do I leverage non-deterministic control flow, and then like how do I do model grounding correctly, and how do I use language as inputs and outputs. It's sort of like a starter kit for all of that, along with some useful agents. But you don't need to know Foundry, and you can actually build agents end to end in Foundry Developer Foundations without even having a Foundry stack. And there's technical reasons. Reach out to me on how we do that. I'll leave link in the description to Foundry Developer Foundations. You can check it out. But by using this pattern, what's cool is we can start to solve like the talent gap problem around Foundry. You don't need to know functions. You don't need to know how to create a repo in Foundry, whatever. You just literally go into GitHub, and then you can deploy that code in Vercel. Like we actually have Vicky running in Vercel right now, so that we can access it on our phone without needing to log into Foundry. We basically created a service account that lets us access Vicky really quickly through our Vercel application. That's super useful as well, because the exact same code I'm showing you there in Foundry Developer Foundations that runs in Vercel is what's running in our compute module in Foundry. And that is a very useful tool, both because now you can start to solve the talent gap. Your developers don't need to know Foundry if you leverage this pattern. It also gives you a migration path out of Foundry, which has been traditionally one of the things that IT departments and risk managers have hit us over the head with time and time again, right? So like usually around the 2 to 3 year mark of a customer journey, what you start to see is risk and compliance wanting to understand what has been built by the Palantir FDEs or internal people on Foundry, because traditionally it goes in through the business. The business might not be aligned with the risk profile. Then they start needing to access data assets that require additional levels of security, or they basically need management service from IT because they can't maintain the application anymore and they can't pay Palantir endlessly to maintain it for them. So they at least need to be able to run it, and then IT comes in and say, okay, but in order to manage this thing for you, we A, need to train people on it, and B, it's we got to bring it in compliance with all of these risk profile things. One of which on the risk profile often is like, how vendor locked is this thing, and can I ever get out of it once I'm in it? With Foundry Developer Foundations and soon to be the equivalent for data engineering, yeah, it's the migration path is there. You can actually put an estimate around the time because it's literally limited to a small set of dependencies that are injected into the application at runtime. Because of that is how we engineered it. The risk box can be checked, and you can easily estimate here's the level of effort to migrate this thing out. You can also implement a lot of cool tooling that we do, like around observability and monitoring, alerting, that isn't in Foundry yet. Their support is being added for distributed tracing right now. That's really cool to see. I'm psyched. Good job, functions team. You'll be able to export that data out into your distributed tracing solutions, but error logging and stuff still isn't there. By leveraging this pattern that we use, we're able to control a lot of that stuff ourselves, and we can just use off-the-shelf software. And again, we can run this code anywhere. It'll run in Foundry, it'll run outside of Foundry. So there's some really distinct advantages when you're thinking about software 3.0 built on Foundry as a Foundry dev, to look at Foundry Developer Foundations, even if you aren't going to use the implementation, to look at it as a pattern to solve some of these problems that you're going to run into. Um, Again, talent gap. You're not going to have a lot of people training Foundry. You need a migration path out of Foundry to check the box with risk profile, et cetera, observability monitoring, using existing tooling. Enterprises often want to use their existing enterprise GitHub repo or Bitbucket or whatever. With Foundry Developer Foundations, you can use any build system you want, any repo system you want. That's also really nice. And it, again, aligns with all the tooling the engineers have already built around GitHub or Bitbucket or GitLab. So being able to integrate that way, I think, is ultra critical if enterprises are going to start building software 3.0 at scale, and that is still an engineering problem. You need a framework and a pattern to work with Foundry that checks a lot of these boxes. And that's why we built Foundry Developer Foundations. Again, I'll leave a link in the description. And lastly, let's just talk a little bit about our mission here. We're trying to essentially build a software company that offers like pre-trained AI workforces for the world. Um, we want to build very domain-specific models around specific job functions, like Vicky, for example, or Benny that does sales, and have those built on foundational ontologies that run in Foundry. And then you can take these workforces, and what you're getting from us is actually a distilled domain-specific model that is tuned to the problem domain. And then you can use that as a workforce, a foundational workforce that you can then continually refine and use our tools to monitor and continually improve. So the idea being is like, why would every enterprise have to build its own agentic workforce to do AR workflow, for example, or executive assistance? Like, that seems ridiculous, and you only get to amortize the cost over a customer base of one. That doesn't scale. So I don't think that enterprises are going to be in the position to say every one of them builds their own agentic workforce. That's asinine and not going to happen. And you're already seeing that there aren't many people in the world that could actually do that. Like these failure rates that all these big four consulting firms are pointing to is evidence of that. Like, it's not an infinite talent pool. So you're really going to need specialized companies, I think, at the end of the day, that are giving you at least the foundational layer and tooling to do these things successfully. Now we're going to build our solutions on Palantir. Again, we think it's the best. Foundry and AIP are the best, premier platform for doing this in the world. I don't think it's even close. And again, our solutions come with both the pre-trained models along with the foundational ontologies, and then all of the engineering around it through Foundry Developer Foundations, which is open source. Amazing, right? Company can come in and take that and integrate it directly into their existing infrastructure. There's not a lot of install work to do. You do have to have Foundry and AIP to leverage the foundational ontology and to deploy the models. But that's our mission, and we believe that this is also how we run our company. So we're using these foundational ontologies and agents ourselves. I use Wiki every day for my comms management. We're starting to release Benny, which will be used every day for sales and pursuit tracking. Like, we're actually building our business on top of these things. Next up is project management. We're also going to do controller and finance. So like we can close our books hopefully automatically at the end of the year using the technology we're offering to the world. So that's our mission. We think it's totally aligned with Palantir's mission as a platform to deliver these solutions and to solve the world's hardest problems. Like, this is a hard problem, and it could, if we do it right, and we scale this approach across multiple companies who can also offer foundational agents that know specific domains really well. I think GDP grows. Like, what would be a 10% efficiency gain in the entire economy as a result of this? Like, that could be nuts. Like, you solve the debt crisis. Like, this is an important problem. Like, reshaping efficiency in America with AI and fundamentally taking underperforming businesses that haven't been good at using technology in the past, which Foundry by itself solves, and combining that with Software 3.0 and building pre-trained workforces so we can scale it, right? The next thing you know, like, the entire economy is functioning better, and your life might actually improve because you could interact with software through language, and you have this like semi-intelligent or pseudo-intelligent thing behind the scenes that you interact with, rather than it being a dumb GUI all the time. It doesn't mean GUIs go away necessarily, but like, I think that using language as the inputs to the system will fundamentally make everyone's life a little better at the end of the day. That's an important mission. That's a mission we're all in on with Palantir. And I'm excited to bring you guys the updates every week. So look forward to our agents being released. Look forward to Foundry Developer Foundations. You can use it today. Jump on GitHub, but get all in on this mission because it isn't bullshit. Like, you'll hear a lot of people poo-poo AI. That doesn't mean the technology is wrong. It's like it's not me, it's you. It's a classic kind of thing. It's like, no, it's not the AI. It's the people trying to apply the AI. Applied AI is hard. But with Foundry and with Palantir and with the right partners, you can actually have success. And I think that this mission is so important, and it could actually solve some real problems in the country, like the debt crisis, right? So like, let's go out there, let's grow GDP, let's leverage these tools correctly, and I'll see you in the next episode.